Good evening and welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey into one of the greatest stories ever told. A tale of love and betrayal, of heroes and cowards, of gods meddling in mortal affairs, and of a war that would echo through the centuries. This is the story of the Trojan War. As always, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let's begin. The Trojan War stands as the cornerstone of Greek mythology, a conflict so vast and so tragic that its echoes rippled through ancient literature for 1,000 years and continue to resonate today. This was not simply a war between two cities. It was a clash of civilizations, a testing ground for heroes, and a stage upon which the gods themselves played out their petty rivalries and grand designs. For 10 long years, the beaches of Troy ran red with blood. The greatest warriors of Greece hurled themselves against walls that would not fall. Inside those walls, the Trojans held fast, knowing that surrender meant death and worse. And above it all, on Mount Olympus, the gods watched and schemed and interfered, taking sides like spectators at a brutal game. But how did it begin? What spark ignited this inferno that would consume so many lives? The answer, as with so many things in Greek mythology, lies with the gods. More specifically, it lies with a golden apple, 3 vain goddesses, and a shepherd prince, who had no idea that his choice would doom his entire city. Before we march to war, before we meet the heroes who would make their names immortal through valor or through tragedy, we must go back. Back to a wedding on Mount Olympus, where the seeds of Troy's destruction were planted in soil that seemed at first quite innocent. The Trojan War was fought, according to the myths, sometime in the late Bronze Age, what the ancient Greeks considered their heroic past. Modern scholars debate whether there was ever a real Trojan War, and if so, when it occurred. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city of Troy, located in what is now northwestern Turkey, was indeed destroyed by fire around 1180 BC, during a period of widespread upheaval across the eastern Mediterranean, known as the Bronze Age collapse. But the war Homer sang of in the Iliad, the war with its heroes and its gods, its honor and its horror, this war belongs to myth. And in myth, truth and fiction blur together like blood and dust on a battlefield. The Greeks who gathered to assault Troy were called Achaeans in Homer's telling, though we might also call them Mycenaeans after the great citadel cities they built across the Greek mainland. These were warrior kings who ruled from fortresses of massive stone, palaces adorned with frescoes and filled with bronze weapons, chariots, and treasure. They were literate, keeping records on clay tablets in a script we now call Linear B. They traded across the Mediterranean, from Egypt to Italy, and they were not strangers to war. When they sailed for Troy, they brought with them not just soldiers, but the accumulated might of an entire civilization. Bronze swords and spears, shields faced with hide, helmets crested with horsehair, and an unshakable belief that glory in battle was the highest achievement a man could hope for. Troy itself, sitting on a hill overlooking the Dardanelles, controlled the trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea. It was wealthy, well fortified, and proud. The city had withstood attacks before. Its walls, built with massive stones, fitted so precisely that later, Greeks would claim they were the work of gods, had never been breached. Inside those walls lived King Priam, elderly but still commanding respect, his queen Hecuba, and their many children. Chief among them was Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, beloved by his people, devoted to his wife Andromache and their infant son. And then there was Paris, also called Alexander, whose actions would bring ruin to everything his family had built. But before Paris made his choice, before Helen left Sparta, before the Greek ships gathered at Aulis, there was a wedding. And at that wedding, someone was not invited. The marriage of the mortal hero Peleus to the sea nymph Thetis should have been a joyous occasion. After all, it's not every day that a goddess agrees to marry a human. Thetis was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, one of the 50 Nereids, daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus. She had been courted by both Zeus and Poseidon until a prophecy revealed that any son Thetis bore would be greater than his father. That got the gods' attention in a hurry. Neither Zeus nor Poseidon fancied being overthrown by their own offspring, so they quickly arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal instead. A powerful hero, yes, but mortal nonetheless. Any son of hers would be greater than Peleus, which was no threat to Olympus. Peleus, king of Phthia, was that chosen mortal. The match was arranged with godly assistance, and despite Thetis's initial reluctance, she agreed. Or perhaps she was compelled. The myths are not always clear on that point, and Thetis herself never seems entirely happy with the arrangement, but wedding plans were made. A grand celebration was organized on Mount Pelion, or perhaps on Olympus itself, depending on which version of the story you prefer. All the gods and goddesses were invited. The divine guest list was impressive. Zeus himself attended, along with his wife Hera. Athena came, goddess of wisdom and war. Apollo brought his lyre. Aphrodite arrived in all her stunning beauty. The Muses sang. Ambrosia and nectar flowed freely. It was the social event of the age. But there was one goddess who did not receive an invitation, Eris, goddess of strife and discord. Now you might think this was an understandable oversight. After all, who invites the goddess of discord to a wedding? She's the personification of arguments, the spirit of conflict. Having Eris at your celebration is like inviting a match to a powder keg and hoping nothing goes wrong. So perhaps Peleus and Thetis thought they were being prudent. Perhaps they genuinely forgot. Or perhaps the other gods decided to exclude her deliberately, hoping for one peaceful celebration where nobody started a divine argument. Big mistake. Eris discovered the slight. Whether she saw the festivities from afar or simply knew through that mysterious awareness gods seem to possess, she found out that every deity in the Greek pantheon had been invited except her. And she was, predictably, furious. But Eris was cunning. She didn't storm into the wedding throwing thunderbolts or turning anyone into animals. No, her revenge was far more subtle and infinitely more devastating. She took a golden apple. Sources vary on whether it came from the garden of the Hesperides or was simply a golden apple of discord itself. Upon this apple, Eris inscribed words that, in the most common telling, read, "To the fairest." In ancient Greek, this could imply the inscription read something like Kallisti, simple, elegant, deadly. Then Eris appeared at the wedding, just long enough to roll the apple into the midst of the celebrating gods. Some versions say she threw it. Others claim she simply set it down where everyone could see it. The effect was the same. The golden apple, gleaming and beautiful with its inscription clearly visible, caught everyone's attention. And immediately, 3 goddesses stepped forward, each certain that the apple was meant for her. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, protector of marriage and women, she who sat beside the throne of Olympus and commanded respect from every immortal. Surely the fairest of goddesses must be her. Athena, grey-eyed goddess of wisdom, patron of heroes, beloved by craftsmen and warriors alike. She who sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, dressed in armor and ready for battle. Clearly the apple belonged to her. And Aphrodite, born from sea foam, goddess of love and beauty itself. Every grace and charm at her command. Every heart susceptible to her influence. Obviously, the most beautiful goddess could only be her. 3 goddesses, 1 apple, and absolutely none of them willing to concede that either of the others might be fairer. The argument began immediately. Each goddess made her case. Hera pointed to her status and power. Athena cited her achievements and the respect she commanded. Aphrodite simply gestured to herself, as if her appearance alone should settle the matter, which, to be fair, it probably should have, given that she was literally the goddess of beauty. But Hera and Athena were having none of it. The bickering threatened to turn into something worse. Divine tempers were flaring. The wedding was forgotten as the 3 goddesses argued, each demanding that the others admit her obvious superiority. Zeus, watching this unfold with growing unease, knew he had to do something. He was the king of the gods, after all. The obvious solution would be for him to simply declare a winner. Except there was no way for Zeus to do that without angering 2 goddesses, and quite possibly his own wife. Whichever choice he made, he'd make 2 powerful enemies, Zeus hadn't ruled Olympus for eons by being foolish enough to walk into traps like that. So he made what he thought was a clever decision. He would recuse himself from the judgment. He'd find someone else to make the choice, someone who had nothing to do with Olympus politics, someone who could render an honest, impartial decision. A mortal would do. Mortals didn't have to worry about divine politics. Or at least, that was the theory. Zeus called for Hermes, his messenger, and gave him instructions. Find someone to judge the goddesses. Find someone young, someone known for fairness, someone far enough from civilization that he wouldn't be influenced by prayers to one goddess or another. Hermes knew just the candidate. High on Mount Ida, above the plains of Troy, there lived a shepherd. He was no ordinary shepherd. He was Paris, also called Alexander, a prince of Troy. But Paris didn't know he was a prince. His story is its own small tragedy, though it would soon become part of a much larger one. Paris's mother, Queen Hecuba of Troy, had dreamed before his birth that she would give birth to a flaming torch that would burn Troy to the ground. The priests and seers interpreted this dream as a terrible omen. The child, they said, would bring destruction upon the city. So when Paris was born, King Priam ordered that the infant be taken to Mount Ida and left there to die. It was a common enough solution to unwanted children in mythology. Abandonment with plausible deniability. But as so often happens in these stories, the servant tasked with abandoning the baby couldn't go through with it. Or perhaps he did, but shepherds found the child. Either way, Paris survived. He was raised among shepherds, growing up strong and handsome, completely unaware of his royal blood. He lived a simple life, tending flocks, sleeping under the stars, learning the hills and valleys of Mount Ida. By the time Hermes found him, Paris had earned a reputation as a fair judge. There's a story that Ares once disguised himself as a bull and challenged Paris's own prize bull. When Ares's bull proved superior, Paris awarded the prize to Ares without hesitation, even though it cost him his best animal. The gods noticed such fairness. It made Paris seem like the perfect choice to judge their contest. So Hermes appeared to Paris, probably giving the young shepherd quite a shock. The messenger god explained the situation. 3 goddesses needed a mortal to judge which of them was the fairest. Paris would be that judge. He would make his decision, award the golden apple, and that would be that. Simple, clean, impartial. Paris, still recovering from the sudden appearance of a god, agreed. What else could he do? You don't say no when the gods come calling. Hermes brought the 3 goddesses to Mount Ida. Imagine being a shepherd, living your quiet life among the sheep, and suddenly finding yourself in the presence of 3 of the most powerful goddesses in existence, all demanding that you judge their beauty. Paris must have been terrified. But if he was, the goddesses didn't give him much time to dwell on it. Each, according to most versions of the tale, asked to speak with Paris privately. Each offered him a bribe. This is where the story moves from a simple beauty contest to something much more sinister. The goddesses weren't just asking Paris to make an honest judgment. They were corrupting the process, each trying to buy his decision. Hera went first. She promised Paris power, vast political power. She would make him king of all Europe and Asia. He would rule empires, command armies, bend nations to his will. All the kingdoms of the world would be his if he chose her. It was a tempting offer, especially for a shepherd who thought he was a commoner. But Paris hesitated. Athena came next. She offered wisdom and glory in battle. She would make him the greatest warrior alive, invincible in combat, shrewd in strategy. She would guide his hand in war and his mind in peace. Heroes would sing his praises, his name would echo through the ages, and he would never know defeat. If he chose her, she would grant him prowess beyond any mortals and the adoration of all who valued skill and strength. Again, tempting. Glory was what every Greek hero craved, but Paris was still uncertain. Then Aphrodite made her offer. She didn't promise power or glory or wisdom. She promised love. She promised him the most beautiful woman in all the world, not a goddess, for that would violate divine law, but a mortal woman of such surpassing beauty that men would go to war over her. She spoke of Helen, Queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus, and widely regarded as the most beautiful woman alive. Aphrodite could make Helen love Paris. She could arrange for them to be together. All he had to do was award her the golden apple. Now Paris should have paused at this point. He should have asked some questions, like, for instance, what does it mean that Helen is already married? What happens to her husband? What would be the consequences of taking another man's wife? But Paris was young and foolish, and let's be honest, not thinking with his head. He was a shepherd. He'd never seen a queen. The idea of possessing the most beautiful woman in the world, of being chosen by her through Aphrodite's intervention, overwhelmed whatever common sense he might have had. So Paris made his choice. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. The moment he did, Aphrodite's face lit up with triumph. She promised him she would make good on her word. Helen of Sparta would be his. Hera and Athena, however, were less pleased. Both goddesses, furious at being spurned, swore vengeance. They wouldn't punish Paris directly, not yet, but they would support his enemies. They would aid the Greeks. And when war came to Troy, as it inevitably would after Paris claimed his prize, Hera and Athena would do everything in their power to ensure Troy fell. Paris, still basking in his victory, probably didn't realize the full weight of what he'd just done. He'd made an enemy of two of Olympus's most powerful goddesses. He'd chosen passion over power and wisdom, and he'd set in motion a chain of events that would destroy his city, kill his family, and leave his name synonymous with disaster for the next 3,000 years. Heris, watching from wherever exiled goddesses watch from, must have smiled. Her plan had worked perfectly. 1 apple, 3 words, and the seeds of the Trojan War were planted. Helen's life was never her own. From the moment she was born, or perhaps even before that, her beauty marked her as something apart from ordinary mortals. The gods themselves had a hand in her making. She was the daughter of Zeus, king of the gods, though her mortal mother was Leda, queen of Sparta. The story of Helen's conception is, like many divine unions, both strange and troubling. Zeus, seeing Leda and desiring her, transformed himself into a swan and seduced her. On that same night, Leda lay with her mortal husband, King Tyndareus. The result was that Leda laid eggs, yes, eggs, from which hatched 4 children. Helen and Polydeuces were the children of Zeus, immortal or at least semi-divine. Castor and Clytemnestra were the children of Tyndareus, fully mortal. Helen and Clytemnestra would both feature prominently in the tragedies to come. As Helen grew, her beauty became legendary. Poets struggled to find words adequate to describe her. She was like dawn breaking over the sea, like the first bloom of spring, like starlight given human form. Her beauty wasn't just physical attractiveness, though she had that in abundance. It was something more, something divine, a radiance that drew every eye and quickened every pulse. Men who saw Helen fell in love with her instantly and helplessly. This was not necessarily a blessing. Helen's beauty made her an object, a prize to be won, and from a young age she knew that she would never be allowed to simply be Helen. She would always be Helen the beautiful, Helen the desired, Helen whose face could launch ships and topple kingdoms. When Helen came of age, the suitors came calling, and not just a few suitors. Every prince and king in Greece who was unmarried or willing to abandon his marriage turned up at Sparta, hoping to win Helen's hand. There were dozens of them, perhaps more than 100 depending on which account you read. Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, massive and brave. Diomedes of Argos, skilled in war. Odysseus of Ithaca, clever beyond measure. Philoctetes, master archer. Patroclus, gentle and kind. Ajax the Lesser. Idomeneus of Crete. And Menelaus, brother of the powerful king Agamemnon of Mycenae. They came bearing gifts and promises, each convinced that Helen should be his. Tyndareus, Helen's mortal father, found himself in a difficult position. He had to choose a husband for Helen from among these powerful men, and whichever one he chose, he would disappoint all the others. Some of those disappointed suitors commanded armies. Some had tempers. Sparta, for all its growing power, couldn't afford to make enemies of half the Greek world. Odysseus, clever as always, offered a solution. Let all the suitors swear an oath, he suggested. Let them pledge that whoever is chosen as Helen's husband, the rest will defend that marriage. If anyone tries to abduct Helen or harm her chosen husband, all the suitors will come to his aid. It was brilliant. It bound the suitors together in mutual obligation, ensuring that whoever married Helen would have the backing of Greece's mightiest warriors. And just incidentally, it would also make Helen a pawn in a web of oaths and alliances. But Tyndareus eagerly agreed to Odysseus's plan. The suitors took the oath. They swore by the gods, by the earth, and by their own honor that they would defend Helen's marriage. And Tyndareus made his choice. He selected Menelaus, king of Sparta, brother to Agamemnon of Mycenae. It was a political match. Menelaus was powerful, well-connected, wealthy. He would make Helen a queen. He would protect her. He would honor her. Whether he could make her happy was apparently not part of the calculation. Helen married Menelaus. They had a daughter, Hermione. By all accounts, it was a stable marriage, not passionate, perhaps, not the stuff of love songs, but functional. Menelaus treated Helen well, or at least we have no accounts of him being cruel to her. Helen performed her duties as queen. She oversaw the household, raised her daughter, presided at festivals. Years passed. Helen grew older, though her beauty never faded. If anything, it deepened, becoming more knowing, more melancholy. And then one day, Paris arrived. Paris had recently discovered his true identity. The details vary, but most accounts agree that Paris returned to Troy, was recognized by his parents, and was welcomed back into the royal family despite the prophecy about him bringing ruin to the city. Priam, it seems, could not bring himself to reject his own son, especially one as charming and handsome as Paris. So Paris became a prince of Troy once more, living in the palace, enjoying all the privileges of royal life. But he had not forgotten Aphrodite's promise. The goddess reminded him in case he'd lost track. She told him where to find Helen. She told him to go to Sparta, to see this woman whose beauty surpassed all others, and she promised that when he did, Helen would be his. So Paris traveled to Sparta, on what was ostensibly a diplomatic mission. King Priam of Troy sent his son to establish friendly relations with the Greek kingdoms, to trade, to make alliances. Paris arrived at Sparta's palace and was welcomed as a guest. Menelaus, hospitable as the Greeks prided themselves on being, received Paris with all courtesy. He invited the Trojan prince to dine, to stay, to rest from his journey. He introduced Paris to his household, and that, of course, meant introducing Paris to Helen. What happened next is one of the great debates of the ancient myths. Did Helen go willingly with Paris, or was she abducted? The sources differ, and they differ in ways that tell us as much about the storytellers as about the story. Homer in the Iliad suggests that Helen went willingly, though she later regretted it. She says herself that Aphrodite led her to Troy, which could mean divine compulsion or could be Helen's way of deflecting blame. Other sources have Paris kidnapping Helen, while Menelaus was away at a funeral, spiriting her away with the help of Aphrodite's power. Some versions even have Helen falling genuinely in love with Paris, seeing in him a passion and romance that her marriage to Menelaus lacked. The truth, if there is such a thing in mythology, probably lies somewhere in the middle. Helen was influenced by Aphrodite. How much of her attraction to Paris was real and how much was divine manipulation, we can't know. But she did leave with Paris. She abandoned her husband, her daughter, her duties, and her homeland. Whether she was kidnapped or eloped, she left Sparta and sailed to Troy with Paris. Some versions say she took treasure with her, Menelaus's gold and precious objects, which would suggest planning and intent. Other versions paint her as a victim, swept up in forces beyond her control. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Helen loved Paris, or thought she did, but also knew that Aphrodite's power was at work. Perhaps she wanted to leave, but also knew she was being used. Helen's feelings remain, like so much else about her, ambiguous and contested. What isn't ambiguous is what happened next. When Menelaus returned to Sparta and found his wife gone, his palace robbed, and his honor destroyed, he was, understandably, furious. This was not just a personal affront, though it was certainly that. This was a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality. Paris had come as a guest, had eaten at Menelaus's table, had been offered protection and friendship. and he had repaid that hospitality by stealing Menelaus's wife. In the Greek world there was no greater crime. Guest friendship Xenia was sacred. The gods themselves punished those who violated it. Paris had made himself an outlaw, and Troy, by sheltering him, had made itself an enemy of Greece. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon. Together they decided on war. But first they had to gather an army, and here's where Odysseus's clever oath came into play. Menelaus called upon all of Helen's former suitors, reminding them of their pledge. They had sworn to defend Helen's marriage. Now that marriage had been violated and they were obligated to come to Menelaus's aid. Some came willingly, eager for glory and plunder. Others came reluctantly, honor-bound by an oath they'd made years ago. Odysseus himself tried to avoid the obligation by feigning madness, but his ruse was discovered, and he too joined the gathering army. One by one, the heroes of Greece assembled, bringing their soldiers, their ships, their bronze-edged weapons. They gathered at Aulis, a port in Boeotia, where the fleet would assemble for the voyage to Troy. And Helen? She sat in Troy in Paris's chambers waiting. Some sources say she regretted her choice almost immediately. Others say she lived for a time in happiness, or at least in the illusion of it. But as the months passed, and word reached Troy that Greece was mobilizing for war, Helen must have realized what she'd done, or what had been done to her. She had become the cause of a war. Her face, her beauty, her body. These things had become the excuse for armies to march and men to die. Later in the Iliad, Helen refers to herself as a bitch and a horror. She is consumed by guilt and self-loathing, though whether that guilt is for leaving Menelaus or for the suffering she's caused is unclear. The Trojans, for their part, are divided about her. Some want to send her back to avoid war. Others, including Paris and Priam, insist on keeping her. And so the die was cast. Helen remained in Troy, and Greece prepared for war. Of all the Greek leaders who answered Menelaus's call to war, none was more important than Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and Menelaus's elder brother. Agamemnon was the most powerful of the Achaean kings, ruling the wealthiest and most formidable kingdom in Greece. His fortress at Mycenae, built with massive stones that seemed almost inhuman in scale, dominated the Argolid plain. From there, Agamemnon commanded respect and tribute from lesser kingdoms. When he called, others came. It was natural then that Agamemnon would be chosen as commander-in-chief of the Greek forces. He contributed the largest contingent of ships and men, reportedly 100 vessels from his own kingdom. His authority was unquestioned, or at least it was supposed to be. Agamemnon was a complex figure, somewhere between a hero and a tyrant. He was undoubtedly brave, a skilled warrior in his own right, but he was also arrogant, prone to outbursts of temper, and obsessed with honor and status. These traits would serve him well as a commander, giving him the confidence to lead thousands of men into a war that might last years. But they would also create problems, as we'll see. The gathering at Aulis was massive. According to Homer's catalogue of ships in the Iliad, nearly 1,200 vessels assembled there, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. Modern scholars debate these numbers, suggesting they're probably exaggerated. But even if we cut them in half, the fleet at Aulis represented the largest military operation Greece had ever mounted. The ships were lean, graceful things, built for war, with painted eyes on their prows and rams of bronze. They could be rowed or sailed, and they were designed to be beached on hostile shores. The soldiers who would sail in them were a mix of nobles in bronze armor, bearing shields and spears, and common warriors with leather jerkins and whatever weapons they could afford. All of them were there for the same reason, to honor the oath they'd sworn, to win glory in battle, and, not incidentally, to plunder Troy. But the fleet could not sail. Day after day the ships sat in harbor, the men grew restless, and the winds refused to blow in the right direction. Or worse, the winds blew against them, making it impossible to set out across the Aegean. Agamemnon consulted his seers, priests, and prophets. What was wrong? Why were the gods preventing them from sailing? The answer came from Calchas, the expedition's chief seer and prophet, a man who could read omens in the flight of birds and the pattern of entrails. Calchas, after much hesitation, revealed the problem. Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis. The stories vary on how. In some versions, Agamemnon boasted that he was a better hunter than Artemis herself, which was both stupid and offensive. In others, he killed a deer sacred to the goddess. However it happened, Artemis was angry, and she was holding back the winds. She would continue to do so, Calchas said, until Agamemnon made amends. And the price of those amends was steep. Artemis demanded a sacrifice, a human sacrifice. Specifically, she demanded the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter. Imagine being Agamemnon in that moment. You're the commander of the greatest military force Greece has ever assembled. Your brother's honor has been insulted, your family's pride is at stake, and the entire expedition is looking to you for leadership. And now you're told that to proceed you must kill your own child. Some versions of the myth have Agamemnon recoiling in horror, initially refusing, until Menelaus and others persuade him that the good of the expedition must come first. Other versions have Agamemnon accepting almost immediately, his ambition and his sense of duty overriding any paternal feeling. Both versions are probably true to Agamemnon's character. He was capable of love, but he was also capable of ruthless pragmatism. Iphigenia was sent for. Agamemnon lied to his wife Clytemnestra, telling her that Iphigenia was to be married to Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. Clytemnestra, proud and happy, sent her daughter to Aulis. When Iphigenia arrived, the truth was revealed. In some versions, she begged for her life. In others, she accepted her fate nobly, offering herself willingly if it would help the Greeks. Euripides wrote 2 different plays about Iphigenia, and in one, she goes bravely to her death, while in another, she's saved at the last moment by Artemis, who substitutes a deer and whisks Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess. But in the mainstream tradition, the one that Homer and most ancient sources follow, Iphigenia died on the altar at Aulis. Agamemnon, his face set, killed his own daughter to appease Artemis and win favorable winds for the fleet. Clytemnestra never forgave him. She would remember this betrayal, this sacrifice of their child, and when Agamemnon returned from Troy 10 years later, victorious and triumphant, she would have her revenge. But that tragedy lies in the future. For now, the winds changed. Artemis was satisfied, or at least mollified. The fleet could sail. And so, with Iphigenia's blood still fresh on the altar stones, the Greeks set out across the wine-dark sea toward Troy. The journey took days. The 1,000 ships spread across the water like birds of prey. The men sang war songs and boasted of what they would do when they reached Troy. The officers planned strategy, arguing over how best to assault the city. And in the flagship, Agamemnon stood at the prow watching the horizon, knowing that he had already paid a terrible price for this war, and wondering what further costs lay ahead. When the Greeks arrived at Troy, they found a city prepared to resist them. Troy was no minor settlement. It was a wealthy, powerful city with strong walls and a large population. King Priam ruled wisely, and his sons, particularly Hector, were formidable warriors. The Trojans had allies throughout the region, other cities and kingdoms who owed Troy loyalty or who had their own reasons to resist Greek aggression. The Amazons would send warriors. The Ethiopians would send an army led by their king Memnon. The Trojans were not going to fall easily. The Greeks beached their ships and set up camp on the plain outside Troy's walls. They built fortifications of their own, a wall and ditch to protect the ships and the camp. And then the war began in earnest. The first encounters were brutal. The Trojans sallied out to meet the Greeks in open battle. Heroes on both sides sought glory, dueling one another while their armies clashed around them. Men died by the hundreds. The earth soaked up blood like rain, and Troy's walls stood firm, untouched. This was going to be a long war. The Trojan War lasted 10 years, but the Iliad, Homer's great epic about the conflict, covers only a few weeks in the final year. The first 9 years of the war are passed over, mentioned only in passing because they were largely uneventful. Not uneventful in the sense that nothing happened. Men died every day. Cities around Troy were raided and sacked. Skirmishes and ambushes and full-scale battles occurred with grim regularity. But uneventful in the sense that nothing decisive happened. Troy did not fall. The Greeks did not give up. The war simply ground on year after year in a brutal stalemate. The Greeks tried various strategies to break the deadlock. They raided the surrounding countryside, seizing supplies and attempting to cut Troy off from its allies. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, led expeditions that captured and sacked 12 cities near Troy. He was unstoppable in battle, a warrior of such skill and ferocity that his name became synonymous with martial excellence. The Trojans learned to fear him. But even Achilles could not breach Troy's walls. So the war continued. Men who had been young when they sailed from Aulis were now entering middle age. Boys who had been born to camp followers were now old enough to fight. The armies had settled into a kind of routine, the rhythm of war becoming as familiar as the seasons. Morale fluctuated. Sometimes the Greeks were confident, certain that victory was just around the corner. Other times they despaired, wondering if they would ever see their homes again. Some wanted to abandon the siege and sail back to Greece. Others, particularly Agamemnon and Menelaus, refused to consider it. Helen was still in Troy, and as long as that remained true, the war would continue. The Trojans, for their part, had their own struggles. They were under siege, unable to trade freely, their resources slowly dwindling. But they had the advantage of fighting from behind walls, and they had Hector, who was nearly Achilles' equal in battle. Hector led the Trojan forces with courage and skill, and as long as he lived, Troy had hope. The gods, meanwhile, continued to meddle. Hera and Athena, still furious over Paris's choice, supported the Greeks. They whispered encouragement to Greek heroes, turned arrows aside, gave strength to flagging limbs. Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares favored the Trojans. Apollo in particular was Troy's great defender, god of archery and prophecy, protector of the city. He too deflected weapons, healed wounds, and guided Trojan hands in battle. The gods argued among themselves, sometimes even coming to blows over the war. Zeus tried to maintain some neutrality, but even he had his favorites, and his wife Hera was relentless in her hatred of Troy. In the Greek camp, tensions grew. Agamemnon and Achilles, though they fought on the same side, never got along. Agamemnon resented that Achilles was the better warrior, that men spoke of Achilles' prowess more than Agamemnon's command. Achilles, for his part, chafed under Agamemnon's authority, seeing him as a lesser man elevated only by birthright. The two men were a clash waiting to happen, and in the 10th year of the war, it finally did. The beginning of the Iliad is not the beginning of the Trojan War. Homer starts his tale in the war's 10th year with the phrase, "Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles." That wrath, that destructive, all-consuming anger, is the engine that drives the Iliad's plot. But what caused it? Why did Achilles, the Greeks' greatest asset, withdraw from the fighting at the moment when they needed him most? The answer involves pride, a plague, and two women named as prizes of war. During a raid on a city near Troy, the Greeks captured and enslaved many people. Among them were two women. Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo, was taken by Agamemnon as his prize. Briseis, from the same region, was claimed by Achilles. Both women were beautiful, and both had been torn from their homes and families by Greek violence. They had no say in what happened next. Chryses, the priest, came to the Greek camp with a fortune in gold, begging Agamemnon to accept a ransom and return his daughter. He appealed to Agamemnon's honor, to his piety, to his mercy. Chryses wore the sacred insignia of Apollo, and he invoked the god's name in his plea. Most of the Greek army thought Agamemnon should accept the ransom. It was generous, and returning Chryseis would be the honorable thing to do. But Agamemnon refused. He liked Chryseis, he said. He liked her better than his wife Clytemnestra. He intended to keep her, and he told Chryses to leave before he did something violent to a priest. Chryses left, humiliated and grief-stricken, and he prayed to Apollo. He prayed with all the fervor of a devoted priest, reminding Apollo of all the sacrifices he'd made, all the altars he'd built, all the years of service. And he asked Apollo to punish the Greeks for dishonoring him and his god. Apollo, who already favored Troy, was more than happy to oblige. He descended from Olympus with his silver bow and began shooting plague arrows into the Greek camp. Men sickened and died. First the animals, mules, and dogs, then the soldiers themselves. The funeral pyres burned day and night, and still the plague continued. After 9 days of this, Achilles called an assembly. Someone, he said, needed to figure out why the gods were punishing them. They needed a seer, a prophet, someone who could interpret divine will. Calchas, the expedition's prophet, stood up. He knew why Apollo was angry, he said, but he feared to speak because his words would anger Agamemnon. Achilles promised to protect Calchas, swearing that no one would harm him while Achilles lived. Reassured, Calchas revealed the truth. Apollo was angry because Agamemnon had dishonored his priest. The plague would continue until Chryseis was returned to her father without ransom, and a great sacrifice was made to Apollo. Agamemnon, hearing this, flew into a rage. He accused Calchas of always prophesying doom, never good news. But he admitted, grudgingly, that he would return Chryseis if he must. However, he said, he would not go without a prize of his own. If Chryseis was taken from him, he would take someone else's prize to replace her. And he looked directly at Achilles. Here's where pride met pride. Agamemnon, feeling insulted and diminished, lashed out at Achilles. Achilles, never one to back down, responded in kind. They traded insults, each accusing the other of cowardice, greed, and dishonor. The argument escalated rapidly. Achilles called Agamemnon a drunk and a coward who took others' plunder while remaining safe behind the lines. Agamemnon called Achilles insubordinate and threatened to take Briseis from him personally, just to demonstrate who was in command. Achilles, enraged, reached for his sword. For a moment it seemed he might actually kill Agamemnon right there in the assembly. But Athena, invisible to everyone but Achilles, grabbed his hair and pulled him back. She whispered that if he waited, if he held his temper, he would be rewarded threefold for this insult. So Achilles stayed his hand, but he didn't hold his tongue. He told Agamemnon that he was withdrawing from the war. He and his myrmidons, his personal soldiers, would fight no more for Agamemnon. Let the king and his army face the Trojans without Achilles' help. Let them see how much they needed him. And as for Briseis, let Agamemnon take her. Let him demonstrate his power by stealing from a better man. But Achilles swore by his scepter that Agamemnon would regret this day. A time would come when the Greeks would beg for Achilles' help, when Hector would be slaughtering them by the hundreds, and Agamemnon would realize too late that he had dishonored his best warrior. Achilles stormed out of the assembly, and Agamemnon, true to his word, sent heralds to Achilles' tent to take Briseis. Achilles let them take her without a fight, though his rage was barely controlled. He watched her go, and then he walked alone to the shore. There, he prayed to his mother, Thetis, the sea nymph. Thetis rose from the waves and listened to her son's grief and anger. Achilles told her what Agamemnon had done, and begged her to intercede with Zeus. "Ask Zeus," he said, "to give victory to the Trojans for a while. Let the Greeks suffer without Achilles. Let them be driven back to their ships. Let Agamemnon realize his mistake. Only when Agamemnon begs for forgiveness, only when he offers proper recompense, will Achilles fight again." Thetis, who loved her son deeply and knew his fate was to die young at Troy, agreed. She went to Zeus and made her plea. Zeus owed her favors, she reminded him. Long ago she had saved him from a rebellion by other gods. Now she was calling in that debt. "Grant Achilles his wish," she said. "Let the Trojans win for a while." Zeus agreed, though he knew Hera would be furious. And so it was decided. The tide of war would turn against the Greeks, and they would suffer terribly, all because of Agamemnon's pride. With Achilles refusing to fight, the Greeks quickly found themselves in trouble. Hector, seizing the opportunity, led the Trojans in a series of fierce attacks. The battles raged across the plain between Troy and the Greek ships. Men fell on both sides, but the Greeks, without their best warrior, were losing ground. Day after day, the Trojans pushed them back. Heroes on both sides distinguished themselves. Hector killed many Greeks, his spear never missing its mark. Diomedes, a Greek warrior, had his day of glory, even wounding the gods Ares and Aphrodite when they intervened in the fighting. Ajax the Greater, massive and strong, held the line when others broke. But none of them could replace Achilles. Agamemnon, seeing his army being beaten back, tried to make amends. He sent envoys to Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor, offering incredible gifts. He would return Briseis untouched. He would give Achilles 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 cauldrons, 12 prize-winning horses, and 7 skilled women. He would give Achilles 7 cities to rule, and he would give Achilles one of his own daughters in marriage, with no bride price required. It was an astonishing offer, more than any man could reasonably expect, but Achilles refused. His honor had been wounded too deeply. No amount of treasure could erase Agamemnon's insult. He told the envoys that he was considering sailing home to Greece. Let Agamemnon win his war without Achilles' help. The fighting continued. The Trojans grew bolder, pushing all the way to the Greek fortifications. They set fire to one of the Greek ships. If the ships burned, the Greeks would be trapped in Troy, unable to return home. Panic began to spread through the Greek ranks, and in his tent Achilles watched his comrades suffer and did nothing. But he was not unmoved. His closest friend Patroclus came to him and begged him to reconsider. If Achilles wouldn't fight, Patroclus said, then let Patroclus fight in his place. Let Patroclus wear Achilles' armor, so the Trojans would think Achilles had returned. That might be enough to turn the tide. Achilles, after some hesitation, agreed. He gave Patroclus his armor, but he warned him sternly, "Drive the Trojans away from the ships, but do not pursue them. Do not try to storm Troy. Do not seek glory for yourself. Just save the ships and come back." Patroclus agreed. He armed himself in Achilles' bronze, took up Achilles' shield and spear, though not Achilles' great spear, which only Achilles could wield, and led the Myrmidons into battle. The effect was immediate. The Trojans, seeing what they thought was Achilles back in the fight, fell back in fear. Patroclus fought magnificently, killing many Trojans and driving them away from the ships. He saved the Greek fleet. But then, flushed with success, intoxicated with battle fury, he forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the Trojans all the way back to the walls of Troy. He killed Sarpedon, a son of Zeus and one of Troy's greatest allies. He pressed forward again and again until Apollo himself intervened. Apollo, protecting Troy, struck Patroclus from behind. The blow dazed him, knocked Achilles' helmet from his head, broke his spear, and shattered his shield. Patroclus stood there, stunned and defenseless, and then a Trojan named Euphorbus thrust a spear into his back. Patroclus staggered, tried to retreat, but it was too late. Hector saw his opportunity. He moved in and drove his spear through Patroclus's stomach, the bronze point emerging from his back. Patroclus fell, and the earth trembled at his fall. Hector stood over him triumphant. He taunted the dying man, saying that Achilles, for all his might, had done nothing to save him. Patroclus, with his last breath, made a prophecy. He told Hector that death was already standing over him, that Achilles would kill him soon to avenge this moment. Then Patroclus died, and his soul fled to the underworld. The fighting over Patroclus's body was fierce. The Trojans, led by Hector, tried to strip the body and drag it back to Troy. The Greeks, led by Menelaus and Ajax, fought desperately to protect their fallen comrade. Hector managed to strip Achilles' armor from Patroclus's body and put it on himself, which was an act of hubris that would not end well for him, but the Greeks eventually recovered Patroclus's body and carried it back to their camp. When news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, he fell apart. He tore his hair, poured dust over his head, and screamed in anguish. Antilochus, who brought the news, had to physically restrain Achilles, fearing that he would kill himself in his grief. Thetis heard her son's cries from beneath the sea and came to him. She found him lying on the ground, weeping, surrounded by his men, who wept with him. Achilles told his mother that he wanted to die. What was the point of living if Patroclus was dead? He had failed his friend, had let him go into battle in his place, had let him die. And it was all Agamemnon's fault, all because of that stupid quarrel. Thetis comforted him as best she could, but she knew there was no comfort for this grief. She told Achilles that if he went back to war to avenge Patroclus, his own death would follow soon after. It had been prophesied. Achilles would die at Troy, killed by Paris and Apollo. Achilles said he didn't care. If he couldn't save his friend, then what good was a long life? He would kill Hector, and after that, whatever happened, happened. Let his own death come. Thetis wept, but she knew she could not change his mind. So she made him a promise. She would go to Hephaestus the smith god, and have him forge new armor for Achilles, armor fit for the greatest of heroes. Until then, Achilles should wait. He should not enter the battle unprotected. Achilles agreed, though waiting was agony. The next morning Thetis returned with the new armor. Hephaestus had outdone himself. The shield alone was a work of art, decorated with scenes of the entire world, cities at peace and at war, farmers tilling fields, shepherds tending flocks, the ocean, the stars, everything. It was more than just a shield. It was a vision of all that Achilles was fighting for and all that he would never have, because his fate was to die young. Achilles put on the armor and it fit perfectly. He looked like a god, terrible and beautiful, divine wrath made flesh. Then he went to Agamemnon and declared that their quarrel was over. He didn't forgive Agamemnon. Forgiveness was not in Achilles' nature, but he acknowledged that their feud had cost too many lives, including Patroclus. It had to end. Agamemnon, humbled by recent events and by Achilles' obvious grief, agreed. He offered the gifts again, all the treasure he had promised before. Achilles waved it away. He didn't care about gifts. He cared about revenge. Then Achilles armed himself fully, rallied the Myrmidons and went to war. What followed was a massacre. Achilles cut through the Trojan ranks like a force of nature. He killed everyone in his path, noble and common, warrior and charioteer, young and old. His spear never missed, his sword never dulled. He chased fleeing Trojans into the river Scamander and filled it with so many corpses that the river god himself rose up in protest, begging Achilles to stop defiling his waters. Achilles fought the river god. He would have drowned if Hephaestus hadn't intervened, using fire to dry up the river. The Trojans fled back toward their city, the gates of Troy opening to receive the survivors. All except one. Hector, Prince of Troy, greatest of the Trojan warriors, stood outside the gates alone. He would face Achilles. He would avenge Patroclus' death or die trying. King Priam, watching from the walls, begged his son to come inside. Troy's gates were still open. Hector could retreat to safety. They could withstand a siege. But if Hector died, Troy would fall. Hecuba, Hector's mother, joined her husband's pleas. She tore at her clothes and reminded Hector that she had nursed him as a baby, that he was her beloved son. But Hector refused. He had led the Trojans in their attack on the Greek ships. He had killed Patroclus, greatest of the Greek heroes after Achilles. He had worn Achilles' armor as a trophy. How could he retreat now? His honor would not allow it. He would face Achilles or die in the attempt. So Hector waited, alone, as Achilles approached. As Achilles drew near, terrible in his divine armor, his eyes blazing with hatred, even Hector felt fear. He turned and ran. Not in cowardice exactly, but in the instinctive human reaction to facing something overwhelming. And Achilles chased him. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, Achilles pursuing, Hector fleeing, and all of Troy watching from the walls in horror. The gods watched too. Zeus, moved by Hector's plight, considered saving him. He even held up his golden scales, weighing the fates of Hector and Achilles. But Hector's scale sank down toward the underworld. His doom was sealed. Apollo, who had protected Hector throughout the war, abandoned him, and Athena, ever the enemy of Troy, decided to intervene. She appeared to Hector in the form of his brother Deiphobus, one of Hector's fellow warriors. The disguised goddess told Hector that he had come to help, that together they could face Achilles. Hector, believing he had support, stopped running and turned to face his pursuer. Achilles approached and Hector tried to talk. He proposed terms. Let them agree that whoever wins will return the other's body to his people for proper burial. Let them fight with honor. Achilles laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. There were no agreements between lions and men, he said. There would be no oaths between him and Hector. One of them would die here, and Achilles intended it to be Hector. Then he hurled his spear. Hector, a skilled warrior, dodged it easily. The spear sailed past and stuck in the ground behind him. But Athena, invisible, picked it up and returned it to Achilles. Hector threw his own spear, a perfect cast that struck Achilles' shield dead center. But the shield Hephaestus had made could not be pierced. The spear bounced off harmlessly. Hector turned to Deiphobus, asking for another spear, but Deiphobus was gone. There was no one there. Hector realized then that he had been tricked by the gods, that he was alone and that he was going to die. But Hector was a hero. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. He drew his sword and charged at Achilles. Achilles, with his longer spear, had the advantage. He studied Hector, looking for a weakness in the armor, and then he saw it. A gap at the collar, right where the neck met the shoulder, unprotected by bronze. Achilles aimed for that spot and thrust. His spear pierced Hector's throat, not deep enough to kill instantly, but deep enough that Hector fell, gasping, blood bubbling from his mouth. Achilles stood over him, triumphant. He told Hector that dogs and birds would eat his corpse, that he would be dishonored in death. Hector, dying, begged Achilles to accept ransom from his parents, to let his body be returned to Troy for proper burial. But Achilles refused. Nothing, he said, could persuade him to give Hector's body back. He wished he could bring himself to eat Hector's flesh raw, such was his hatred. Hector's final words were a prophecy, much like Patroclus's had been. He told Achilles that he would not live much longer, that Paris and Apollo would kill him at Troy's gates. Then Hector died. Achilles, still consumed with rage and grief, did something terrible. He pierced Hector's heels and threaded straps through the wounds. Then he tied the straps to his chariot, and with Hector's body dragging behind, Achilles drove his chariot around the walls of Troy, desecrating the body in full view of Hector's family and all the Trojans. Priam and Hecuba screamed from the walls. Andromache, Hector's wife, fainted when she saw what was being done to her husband's body. Achilles dragged Hector's corpse back to the Greek camp, and for the next 12 days, every morning, he drove his chariot around Patroclus's funeral mound, dragging Hector behind him. It was a monstrous act, a violation of every code of honor the Greeks claimed to follow. Even the gods were disturbed. Apollo protected Hector's body from decay and disfigurement, but he could not stop Achilles' desecration. Finally, Zeus had enough. He sent Thetis to tell Achilles to release Hector's body, and he sent Iris, his messenger, to tell Priam to go to Achilles and ransom his son's corpse. Priam, old and broken, did as the gods commanded. In the dead of night, guided by Hermes, he went to Achilles' tent. He found Achilles there, eating dinner with his men. Priam fell to his knees and did something unthinkable for a king. He kissed the hands of Achilles, the hands that had killed his son. He begged Achilles to think of his own father, Peleus, who was old like Priam, and would one day mourn Achilles. He offered a fortune in ransom. He pleaded for mercy, for basic human decency, for the chance to give his son a proper funeral. And something in Achilles broke. Not his rage, that was still there, but his grief found a crack to pour through. He looked at Priam and saw his own father. He thought of Patroclus lying in a tomb, and of Hector lying unburied. He thought about how the gods played with mortals like toys, how Zeus bestowed suffering and joy from his urns with no regard for justice or fairness, and he wept. Priam wept too. The two men, enemies, mourners, sat together and cried for their losses. When they had finished, Achilles gently helped Priam to his feet. He told his men to wash and anoint Hector's body, to dress it in fine clothing, and to prepare it for return to Troy. He promised Priam a truce, 12 days for Hector's funeral, and swore that the Greeks would not attack during that time. Priam thanked him, accepted the ransom terms, and that night slept in Achilles' tent under his enemy's protection. In the morning, Priam returned to Troy with Hector's body. The city mourned. For 9 days they gathered wood for the funeral pyre. On the 10th day, they burned Hector's body with all honor, and Andromache, Hecuba, and Helen all lamented him. Helen, weeping, said that in all her years in Troy, Hector had never spoken a harsh word to her, had always treated her with kindness, even though she was the cause of the war. Hector's ashes were placed in a golden urn, and a great tomb was built for him. Then the Trojans held funeral games, as was custom, and on the 12th day the war resumed. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, but the war was not over. Achilles continued to fight, and his reputation grew even greater. He killed Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, who had come to aid Troy. Some stories say he He fell in love with her the moment he saw her face after killing her, adding another tragedy to his list. He killed Memnon, king of Ethiopia, another of Troy's allies, in single combat. Achilles seemed unstoppable, but his mother's prophecy hung over him. He would die at Troy. He knew this. He had always known it. When he was a boy, Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable. She held him by the heel, and that heel remained dry, unprotected by the Styx's waters. That one spot was Achilles' weakness, though few knew it. Paris, hiding on Troy's walls with Apollo guiding his aim, shot an arrow. It flew true, striking Achilles in the heel, the one place he could be wounded. The poison on the arrow did the rest. Achilles, greatest of the Greeks, warrior without equal, fell. His death was mourned by the entire Greek army. They held funeral games in his honor. His ashes were mixed with Patroclus's, placed in a golden urn, and buried beneath a great mound on the shore, just as Patroclus's ghost had requested. In the underworld, their shades would walk together forever. But with Achilles dead, the Greeks needed a new plan. They could not breach Troy's walls through force. They had been trying for nearly 10 years, and Troy stood firm. They needed cunning, not strength. They needed Odysseus. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, was famous for his cleverness. He was not the strongest warrior or the bravest, though he was both strong and brave, but his real gift was his mind. He could see solutions others missed, could craft plans that turned defeat into victory. And now, with the war grinding on and no end in sight, Odysseus came up with his most audacious plan yet. He proposed building a horse, not a real horse, but a massive wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to hide armed men within. They would present this horse to the Trojans as a gift to Athena, a thanks offering for a safe return home. Then the Greeks would pretend to give up the siege. They would burn their camps, board their ships, and sail away, leaving the horse behind. If the Trojans brought the horse into the city, the hidden warriors could emerge at night, open the gates, and let the Greek army, which would have sailed back under cover of darkness, into Troy. It was a mad plan, relying on the Trojans' credulity, their exhaustion after 10 years of war, and their religious piety. But Odysseus believed it could work, and the other Greek leaders, desperate for any hope of ending the war, agreed to try. They set Epeius, a skilled craftsman, to building the horse. It took days to construct, massive beams of wood fitted together, carved and painted to look like an offering worthy of a goddess. When it was finished, it stood taller than Troy's walls, a monument to Greek ingenuity and desperation. Odysseus selected the men who would hide inside. He chose the best warriors remaining, men like himself, Diomedes, Menelaus, and others who could be trusted to remain silent for hours, and then fight ferociously when the time came. 30 men in one account, 50 in another. The numbers vary, but all agree they were the cream of the Greek army. On the chosen night, the men climbed inside the horse. The trapdoor was sealed behind them. The rest of the Greek army broke camp, burning their shelters and boarding the ships. To the Trojans watching from the walls, it looked like the siege was finally over. The Greeks were leaving. In the darkness before dawn, the fleet sailed away, disappearing over the horizon. But they didn't sail far. They went to the nearby island of Tenedos, just out of sight, and waited. When the sun rose, the Trojans cautiously opened their gates and ventured out onto the plain for the first time in years. They found the Greek camp abandoned, the ships gone, and in the center of it all, the enormous wooden horse. It was beautiful and strange, clearly a work of great craftsmanship, and it bore an inscription dedicating it to Athena for the Greeks' safe return home. The Trojans debated what to do. Some wanted to drag the horse inside the city. It was a gift to Athena, after all, and they could rededicate it to the goddess in their own temple. Others were suspicious. A few suggested burning the horse or throwing it off a cliff. And then there was Laocoon, priest of Apollo, who famously shouted, "I fear Greeks, even those bearing gifts." He warned that the horse was a trick, that the Greeks would never simply abandon the war and leave such a magnificent offering behind. To prove his point, Laocoon threw a spear at the horse's side. The spear stuck, and from inside came a faint sound, like groaning wood, or like men shifting nervously. But before anyone could investigate further, shepherds arrived dragging a Greek soldier they had found hiding near the shore. This soldier, whose name was Sinon, was part of Odysseus's plan. He had volunteered to be left behind to play the role of desperate deserter. Sinon told an elaborate story. He claimed that the Greeks had abandoned him, that they were going to sacrifice him to ensure favorable winds for their journey home, and that he had escaped and hidden. As for the horse, Sinon said it was indeed an offering to Athena, but the Greeks had made it too large deliberately. They knew the Trojans might want to take it into the city, but if they did, they would have to break down part of their walls to get it through the gates. Athena, Sinon claimed, would then favor Troy instead of Greece. The Greeks hoped the Trojans would be too afraid to damage their walls and would leave the horse outside. It was a masterful lie, blending truth and fiction, playing on Trojan piety and pride. While the Trojans were debating Sinon's story, a terrible thing happened. Two enormous serpents emerged from the sea and slithered toward Laocoon. The priest, seeing them coming, tried to flee, but the serpents were too fast. They wrapped around Laocoon and his two sons, crushing them, and then disappeared back into the sea. To the Trojans, this seemed like a clear divine sign. Different accounts attribute the serpents to different gods. Some say Athena sent them, others say Poseidon or Apollo. But to the watching Trojans the message appeared obvious. Laocoon had offended the gods by attacking their offering with his spear, and he had been punished. Sinon's story must be true. The horse was sacred, and so despite the warnings, despite the lingering suspicions, the Trojans decided to bring the horse into the city. They had to partially dismantle their gates to get it through, just as Sinon had said. But they managed it. The wooden horse was dragged through Troy's streets to the temple of Athena, where it was dedicated to the goddess. Then the Trojans celebrated. After 10 years of war, after so much death and suffering, the siege was over. The Greeks were gone. Troy had survived. They feasted, they drank, they sang. Joy filled the city for the first time in a decade, but not everyone celebrated. Cassandra, Priam's daughter and Apollo's cursed prophetess, ran through the streets screaming that the horse would destroy them all. Apollo had given her the gift of prophecy, but when she refused his advances, he cursed her so that no one would ever believe her predictions. The Trojans ignored her now, as they always did. And Helen, walking around the horse with Priam's son Deiphobus, who had married her after Paris's death, called out the names of the Greek warriors imitating their wives' voices. She was testing to see if anyone was inside, though whether she hoped to find them or to warn them is unclear. Odysseus, inside the horse, kept his hand over Patroclus's mouth to prevent him from responding. The night wore on. The celebrations continued, and slowly the Trojans, exhausted and drunk, went to sleep. At midnight, Sinon crept to the horse and gave the signal. On Tenedos, the Greek fleet saw the beacon fire and began rowing back toward Troy. Inside the horse, Odysseus and the others listened, waiting for absolute silence from the city. Then they opened the trapdoor. One by one, the Greek warriors climbed down, their weapons ready. They moved through the sleeping city like shadows, killing the guards at the gates and opening them wide. The main Greek army, now back at Troy's shore, poured through the gates. They spread through the city, torches in hand, setting fires, killing anyone who resisted. Troy, after 10 years of withstanding siege, fell in a single night. The sack of Troy was brutal. Greek soldiers, angry after a decade of war, showed no mercy. They killed Trojan men, even boys, to ensure no one would survive to rebuild and seek revenge. King Priam, old and helpless, was slaughtered at the altar where he had sought sanctuary. His grandson, Hector's infant son Astyanax, was thrown from the walls to ensure he could never grow up to avenge his father and grandfather. The Trojan women were enslaved. Hecuba, who had been queen of Troy, was taken as a slave. Andromache, Hector's widow, was given to Achilles' son Neoptolemus. Cassandra was claimed by Agamemnon, though she tried to cling to Athena's statue for protection. Ajax the Lesser dragged her away, committing sacrilege that would later bring punishment upon the entire Greek fleet. The Greeks looted Troy's palaces and temples, taking gold, precious objects, weapons, anything of value. And they burned the city. The flames rose high into the night sky, and Troy, which had stood for generations, was reduced to ash and rubble. A few Trojans escaped the massacre. Aeneas, carrying his father Anchises on his back and leading his son Ascanius by the hand, fought his way out of the burning city. He took with him the sacred images of Troy's gods and a group of survivors. According to Roman legend, Aeneas would eventually sail to Italy and become the ancestor of the Romans. But for most Trojans, there was no escape. Troy fell, and with it fell an age. The war was over. The Greeks had won. But at what cost? Helen was recovered, though whether she wanted to be is debatable. Menelaus, seeing her again after 10 years, was supposedly so overwhelmed by her beauty that he forgave her. They sailed back to Sparta together, and some versions say they lived happily ever after. Other versions are less charitable, but Helen survived. The other Greeks were not so fortunate. Agamemnon sailed home victorious, bringing Cassandra as his prize, but Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing Iphigenia, murdered him in his bath shortly after his return. She and her lover Aegisthus ruled Mycenae until Agamemnon's son Orestes, grown to manhood, returned and avenged his father by killing his mother. Many Greek leaders died on the voyage home, their ships wrecked by storms sent by angry gods. Ajax the Lesser was struck by lightning from Athena for his sacrilege. Odysseus, whose clever plan had won the war, was cursed by Poseidon and spent 10 years wandering the Mediterranean, facing monsters and witches and endless trials before finally reaching Ithaca. His story is told in Homer's Odyssey, a second epic that shows the costs of the war in individual terms. And what of the gods? They had gotten their war. They had played their games with mortal lives. Hera and Athena had their revenge on Paris and Troy. Aphrodite had given Paris what she promised, though it brought him no happiness. Zeus's plan, whatever it truly was, had been fulfilled. The population of heroes was culled, the age of legends was ending, and the world was moving toward something more like the historical Greece that would emerge centuries later. The Trojan War achieved its purpose, at least from the gods' perspective. But the mortals who fought it, who bled and died and lost everything, they paid the price for divine whims. The Trojan War, whether it truly happened or not, became the defining story of Greek culture. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were recited throughout the ancient world, memorized by school children, quoted by philosophers, performed at festivals. The characters, Achilles and Hector, Odysseus and Priam, Agamemnon and Helen, became archetypes. They embodied virtues and flaws that the Greeks recognized in themselves. Achilles was the epitome of martial prowess and also of pride. Hector was duty and honor facing inevitable doom. Odysseus was cleverness triumphing over strength. Helen was beauty as both blessing and curse. These were not just stories. They were lessons in what it meant to be human, what it meant to face impossible choices, what it meant to live with the consequences of those choices. Archaeologists have found Troy, or at least a city they believe to be Troy, on the Turkish coast near the Dardanelles. The site has many layers, cities built on top of cities going back millennia. One of those layers, called Troy 7A, shows evidence of destruction by fire around 1180 BC, which roughly aligns with some of the ancient Greek estimates for when the Trojan War might have occurred. But whether there was actually a war between Greeks and Trojans, whether Helen really existed, whether any individual hero matches the men Homer sang of, we will never know for certain. The myths and the history are too tangled, but perhaps that doesn't matter. The Trojan War is true in the way that myths are true. It tells us something fundamental about conflict, about the futility of war even in victory, about how pride and honor and love can drive people to do terrible things. The gods, in the end, were just amplified versions of human passions. When Hera schemes and Athena aids her favorites, and Aphrodite grants beauty and desire, they are acting out human impulses on a divine scale. The Trojan War is a story about what happens when those impulses, passion, pride, vengeance, are given free rein. Cities burn, heroes die, families are destroyed, and for what? For Helen, who may not have wanted to be the cause of all this, for honor, which proved to be a hungry god demanding endless sacrifice, for glory, which turned out to be ashes and grief. Modern readers sometimes struggle with the ethics of the Iliad. Why should we admire Achilles when he desecrates Hector's body? Why should we respect Agamemnon when he sacrifices his daughter? Why is Helen blamed when she was a victim of divine manipulation? These are fair questions, and they show how much our values have changed since Homer's time. The ancient Greeks had different ideas about honor, about the role of women, about the relationship between humans and gods. But the story still resonates because underneath the Bronze Age customs and the divine interventions, the Iliad is asking timeless questions. What is worth dying for? How do we face death with courage? What does it mean to be a good person in a world where the good often die young and the cruel often prosper? The Trojan War reminds us that there are no clean victories. The Greeks won, but they lost Achilles, Ajax, Patroclus, and countless others. They came home to find their kingdoms changed, their families broken. Agamemnon was murdered. Odysseus spent 10 more years wandering. The war that was supposed to restore honor ended up destroying it. And Troy, for all its faults, for all that Paris did in taking Helen, did not deserve to be utterly annihilated. The women and children of Troy bore no responsibility for the war, yet they suffered most. There's a moment in the Iliad, just before Hector goes out to face Achilles, when he says goodbye to his wife Andromache and their infant son. Hector knows he's going to die, but he fights anyway because his honor demands it. Andromache begs him to stay, to live, to think of her and their child. But Hector can't. And after he dies, Andromache is enslaved, and their son is murdered. That moment, more than any battle, shows the true cost of the war. Honor demands sacrifice, and those who die are often not the ones who made the choice. The Trojan War has echoed through Western literature ever since Homer. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, telling the story from the Trojan perspective and creating a founding myth for Rome. Medieval poets retold the tale with different emphases, often making Paris and Helen into tragic lovers rather than adulterers. Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida presented a cynical view of the war, stripping away the glory to show the pettiness and violence underneath. Modern novels and films continue to grapple with the myth, sometimes treating it as historical fiction, sometimes as pure fantasy. Every generation finds something new in the story because the questions it asks, about war, about love, about what it means to be heroic, never go away. In the 21st century, we might see the Trojan War differently than ancient Greeks did. We might see it as a critique of toxic masculinity, with Achilles' rage destroying everyone around him. We might see it as a feminist text, with Helen trapped by forces beyond her control and blamed for men's choices. We might see it as anti-war literature, showing how a conflict begun for dubious reasons drags on and on, consuming everything it touches. All these readings are valid, because the Iliad is rich enough, complex enough to support multiple interpretations. That's what makes it a masterpiece. It doesn't give us easy answers. It shows us flawed people making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, and it lets us draw our own conclusions. The gods in the story represent fate, chance, the inexplicable forces that shape our lives. Sometimes the gods help, sometimes they hinder, and often we can't tell the difference. Achilles was destined to die young. He knew it, his mother told him, but he chose to fight anyway, chose glory over a long life. Was that the right choice? The Iliad doesn't say. It just shows us Achilles making it and living with or dying with the consequences. Hector chose duty over survival. Priam chose to risk everything to bury his son properly. Helen, whatever her choices were or weren't, endured. These characters faced impossible situations, and they responded as best they could. Their heroism, if we can call it that, lies not in being perfect but in enduring. So what is the Trojan War ultimately about? It's about many things. It's about how a minor slight can escalate into catastrophe. It's about how pride makes us do stupid things that we later regret. It's about how love, both for partners and for comrades, can be the most powerful force in our lives. It's about how war destroys everyone it touches, victors and vanquished alike. It's about how the gods, or fate, or chance, play with our lives, but we still have to choose how to respond. And it's about stories themselves, about how we tell and retell tales to make sense of our world. to find meaning in suffering, to connect with people who lived 3,000 years ago and yet faced the same fundamental questions we face today. The walls of Troy have fallen. The heroes are dead. The ships have sailed home or tried to. But the story remains. It remains because Homer sang it so beautifully that we can still feel Achilles' rage and Priam's grief. It remains because every generation finds new truths in the old tale. It remains because somewhere deep down we recognize ourselves in these ancient Greeks and Trojans, these people who loved and hated and fought and died, trying to live with honor in a world that often seemed designed to thwart them. And so we remember Troy, not as history exactly, though there may be history buried in the myth, but as a story about us, about humanity, about what we're capable of, both terrible and magnificent. The Trojan War teaches us that even in defeat there can be dignity. Even in victory there can be loss. And even when the gods seem to be playing games with our lives, we still have choices. We can choose courage like Hector. We can choose loyalty like Patroclus. We can choose cunning like Odysseus. We can choose love like Helen, however complicated and costly that love might be. Or we can choose rage like Achilles and burn brightly before we burn out. The story doesn't tell us which choice is right. It just reminds us that we have to choose, and that our choices matter, and that 3,000 years from now, someone might still be telling the story of what we did. If you enjoyed this journey through the myths of the Trojan War, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Mythic Dreamscapes. Let me know in the comments which story from the war resonated with you most. Was it Achilles' grief, Hector's farewell to his family, the tragedy of Helen, or perhaps the cunning of the Trojan horse? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, may you find peace in the stories of the past, and may the myths continue to illuminate the present. Good night, and sleep well.